In this video, we will be thinking about the previous videos such as least common denominator and finding equivalent fractions, finding common denominators. We're going to use all that background knowledge to add and subtract fractions. So here are some fraction problems, and the directions are to solve and simplify the following problems. So there's 4 different problems. Some you'll notice are adding problems and some are subtraction problems, and it's important to think about when you're solving a fraction problem. Am I adding or am I subtracting? So we'll think about that as we go through these problems. So for the first problem, we're going to set it up. That problem was 5/8 plus 3/4. So your first step is always to write the problem, and what we have here is the T-chart, and there's 4 different squares. And as you're going through and adding and subtracting your fractions in your notebook, it's going to be really important that you also set it up like this, because that by setting it up really carefully and organized, you're going to make sure you're getting the problem correct. So after we've written the problem, we're going to move over to this box, find the least common denominator. And we practiced this in a previous video. So our denominators are 8 and 4. We're going to set those over here and start listing out our multiples. And we can see that the matching denominator is 8. So our least common denominator is going to be 8. That's what we're going to end up with our 2 equivalent fractions. So just like in the previous video, let's put our fractions, the original fractions, in the first spots here. Then we're going to think about what are we multiplying by to get to that 8. So 8 times 1 gets us to 8, and 5 times 1 gets us to 5. Down in the bottom, how do we get from 4 to 8? We're going to have to multiply by 2. Do the same thing in the numerator. So our 2 new fractions, like we practiced on the previous video, are 5/8 and 6/8. They have common denominators, or denominators that are the same. So now we're able to go and add. So let's rewrite our problem with our new denominators. We have 5/8 plus 6/8. Just like we talked about in the other videos, the whole is always going to stay the same. So with fractions, this 8 and 8, we're not going to add those together. The 8 is going to stay the same. Our whole, or the amount we need to make a whole, is always going to stay the same. Here's where the adding part comes in. We are going to add the numerators together. So we're going to do 5 plus 6, which is 11. So our fraction is 11/8. We're not done though, because it asks us to simplify or reduce. Right now, this is an improper fraction. And we've learned in previous videos how to turn an improper fraction into a mixed number. It's simply a division problem. So when we do 11 divided by 8, take the numerator and divide it by the denominator, we're going to find out that 8 goes into 11 one time with a remainder of 3. So to turn that into our mixed number, we're going to have 1 whole with 3 left over 8, because our denominator never changes. And now we have our final answer for this problem. So our next problem is 5/12 minus 1/4. So this time it's important to remember we're subtracting. 5/12 minus 1/4. So let's write the problem down. And let's move over to finding our least common denominator. Our denominators here are 12 and 4. Some of you may start getting to the point where you just realize what the common denominator is without writing out the least common denominator. But for these first few problems in your notebook, Mrs. Nash and I would really like you guys to use these 4 boxes so that we know that you know the steps of adding and subtracting fractions. So if I'm listing out my multiples of 8, I'm going to get to 12. So that's going to be our least common denominator. Now I've gotten rid of the boxes because for you guys, when you're doing this in your notebook, you're not going to have the boxes for yourselves to put numbers into. So let's practice finding the equivalent fractions without using the boxes. So we're going to start by writing our original fractions, 5/12 and 1/4. And over here is going to be our final denominators. We want 12 to be that final denominator, the common denominator. So now we're just multiplying by what's going to get us to 12. So 12 times 1 gets us to 12. And 5 times 1 is 5. Down here, 4 times 3 is going to get us to 12. Put these equal signs. That'll help us set this up. So down here we did 4 times 3 is 12, and in the numerator 1 times 3 is 3. So we have our two new fractions with common denominators. We're going to move over to the last box and subtract these fractions. So 5/12 minus 3/12. Remember, our whole is going to always stay the same. So we're just looking at our top two numbers, 5 minus 3, and that's going to be 2. However, 5th graders, we are not done, and you have watched the reducing fractions video, so you know that we could reduce 2/12. We're going to divide 2/12 by a number that can go into the numerator and the denominator. I know that 2 can go into both of those numbers. So 2 divided by 2 is going to be 1, and 12 divided by 2 is going to be 6. So our final answer for this is 1/6. Moving on to our next problem, it's an addition problem, so let's remember to add. We have 8/15 plus 9/15. Let's write that in our box, 8/15 plus 9/15. Now sometimes as we're getting used to going through these steps, we forget about the fact that some fractions might already have common denominators. And if that's the case, we get to skip this step because we don't need to find a least common denominator. They already have a common denominator. And we can skip this step as well. We don't have to rewrite the problems. So we're going to take these fractions all the way to our last step, 8/15 plus 9/15. Our whole is going to stay 15. So we just need to add the numerators. 8 plus 9 is 17. And what we have right now is an improper fraction, so we are going to have to reduce or simplify. We know that to go from an improper to a mixed number, it's just a simple division problem, numerator divided by denominator. So 17 divided by 15. 15 is going to go into 17 one time with 2 left over, and our whole is going to always stay the same. There's our final answer for this problem. All right, 5th graders, we have one problem left as an example on today's video, and that's 11/12 minus 2/8. So let's write out our problem, 11/12 minus 2/8. And we do not have common denominators, so we're going to have to go find the least common denominator for these two numbers. If you remember, I like to write out the bigger multiples first. Because then, once I get to a multiple that I know 8 can go into, I can stop on the top and continue on the bottom. And it looks like that least common denominator is going to be 24. So let's come down to this box and let's write our final fractions with a denominator of 24. Come back over here, write our original fractions. And we are going to have to multiply to change these fractions to eventually get to our fractions with 24 as the denominator. So what are we multiplying 12 by to get to 24? 2. We're going to do the same thing in the numerator. 11 times 2 is 22. Down here, 8 times what's going to get us to 24? 8 times 3. Do the same thing in the numerator. 2 times 3 is 6. And now we have our two new fractions with common denominators. So we can go ahead and subtract. And we got to remember, we are subtracting here. So 22/24 minus 6/24. We know that the denominator is going to stay the same. So now it's just a matter of subtracting 22 minus 6. 22 minus 6 is 16. Are we done? Question mark. We are not, because the directions are to simplify and reduce, so we have to reduce this down. So let's put 16/24 on the bottom here. I know that 2 can go into both of these numbers because they're both even numbers, so I'm going to start by just reducing by 2. 16 divided by 2 is 8. 24 divided by 2 is 12. What I still have are even numbers, so I can go again and divide by 2. But I also know in my head that 4 can go into 8, and I know that 4 can go into 12. So I'm going to, instead of going divided by 2 and 2, I'm going to step it up to 4. 8 divided by 4 is 2, and 12 divided by 4 is 3. There's no other numbers that we can divide both of these numbers by, so our final answer is 2/3.